Have you ever been positive that someone was lying to you? You were so positive, but you just couldn't prove it. So you asked around, tried to get a few different stories, gathered some evidence, showed it to everyone, and they all believed the other person. Maybe it was a sibling who said you broke something instead of them. Maybe it was a coworker who was spreading lies about you at work. Imagine if instead it was the first murder trial in the history of the United States, and you were the assistant attorney general for the state of New York. Then imagine in a few hundred years, one of the guys on the other side gets a Broadway musical made about his life, in which they poke a little fun at your expense. Today we're going to be talking about the murder of Elma Sands. I'll let you know up front, I've been both a defense attorney and I'm currently a prosecutor, and to give you guys the most entertaining and informative breakdown, I took it upon myself to read the entire trial transcript from the year 1800. And I'll tell you right now, it's one of the oddest trials I've ever seen. So for a little background, there were 3 pamphlets made about this trial. One came out immediately after the trial. Within a few hours, it enraged all of New York City. Another was published by a lawyer a little while later, but it was widely regarded as being pretty one-sided, where he would point out contradictions and flaws in one side's arguments that sometimes weren't even there. So the report I read came straight from the Library of Congress, in which it is the best transcript we're going to get. However, there have been stories that were passed down and told that alter some details, but I promise I did my due diligence to at least confirm or mostly confirm that everything here happened. But still, I wouldn't be surprised if you don't believe some of this. On December 22nd, 1799, Gulielma or Elma Sands disappeared. She went out that night with a man named Levi Weeks, who had been staying in the same boarding home as her for several months, and it was thought amongst the people in the house that they were actually courting each other. Before she disappeared, Elma told her cousin that her and Levi were going to be secretly married that night, in a private ceremony before he whisked her away. A few days later, a young boy found a hairpiece of Elma's nearby the Manhattan Well. Authorities looked in the well and unfortunately found the deceased body of Elma Sands. It appeared that she had been severely beaten, but with medical science not being where it is today, they couldn't determine how much of that was actually endured before or after falling into the well, or potentially being thrown. So, the number one suspect is now Levi Weeks, and word got around New York fast. Why? Because Levi Weeks' brother was Ezra Weeks. Ezra Weeks was an architect and one of the most famous people in New York City at the time. We're talking about a time the country had just been founded and everyone was trying to make a name for themselves in New York City. Ezra Weeks had already made a name for himself when he invited his brother, Levi, to come work for him in New York City. Now, when Ezra heard about these charges, he was certainly distraught. So he wanted to go out and recruit the best legal defense that money could buy. And he assembled one of the greatest dream teams of defense attorneys anyone could ever imagine. The first attorney was Henry Brockholst Livingston, who was an officer in the Revolutionary War and only 2 years later would actually be named as a justice in the Supreme Court. The second hire was Colonel Aaron Burr. Yes, the same one who would eventually go on to kill Alexander Hamilton in a duel, who was not only politically and socially well known, he was also considered one of the best defense attorneys in the city. And rounding out this list of celebrity on the defense team was none other than Alexander Hamilton. Yes, you know about the Broadway musical, you probably know he was a general in the Revolutionary War, but don't forget he was also the Secretary of the Treasury up until 1795, and he had already built a gigantic political and legal career by this point. How did Ezra make these connections? Other than with money, of course. Well, it just so happened that Ezra Weeks, along with a man named John Macomb, were actually in the process of building Hamilton's house up in northern Manhattan. And Hamilton wanted the house constructed by John Macomb as well because John Macomb had actually just built Aaron Burr's house, and he wanted his house to be even better. It may not surprise you to find out that Ezra Weeks and John Macomb were the key witnesses of the defense in the trial. Levi Weeks would be arrested very soon after the body was recovered, and a trial would be set. The prosecutor would be Assistant Attorney General and future New York City Mayor Cadwallader David Colden. A solid prosecutor in and of himself, but he was clearly outmatched here. And while I'm sure he had some legal assistance in preparing for the trial, he's the only member of the prosecution mentioned throughout the transcripts. So it seems like he was alone at the prosecution table against these 3 juggernauts. The trial was actually presided over by 3 judges: Chief Justice John Lansing Jr., the mayor of New York City, Richard Harrison, and the recorder Richard Varick, who was actually George Washington's recording secretary during the war. This was a gigantic trial in the city of New York. Everyone knew the evidence. Everyone had heard the rumors. This was the equivalent of a heavyweight fight in the year 1800. Rumors had abounded, but I want to jump straight into the trial, and I want you guys to see evidence in the same way that the jury did. As we jump into the trial, I want to make a couple things clear. First, there's a few issues that get brought up throughout the trial, such as illegal intercourse. A lot of time is spent on whether or not the victim was promiscuous, several of the witnesses being brought up exclusively to testify to her character and to her modesty. So a lot of this I'm going to gloss over, but I do want to mention it here that it was a big deal, and in some cases today remains a big deal, that it was argued heavily by both sides, whether or not the two had even slept together. So as for the transcript, it took 6 notebooks to compile all this information, and the compilation was made to quell the public outcry, and it was a much more neutral take than the first 2 pamphlets that were released. So the court was assembled at 10 a.m. on Monday, March 31st, 1800. There were 34 members in the jury pool. They do make it clear to say that all the Quakers were dismissed at their own request, and they ended up with 12 people on the jury who were all male and they were all white, which was fairly typical for the time. Once the jury was seated, we get into the reading of the indictment. And to give you an idea of how they talked at the time, they said that Levi Weeks, not having the fear of God before his eyes, but being moved and seduced by the instigation of the devil, with force and arms at the ward, did assault the victim. And the indictment then goes on to accuse him of almost every possible way of assaulting the victim. This to me seems intentionally very broad. Usually in indictments and complaints today, you want to be very specific, but we're talking 225 years ago. The indictment essentially says the defendant or the prisoner choked, suffocated, drowned, threw, pushed, cast, assaulted, kicked, struck, and beat the victim in the head, breast, back, belly, sides, and other parts of her body, and threw her into the well in a manner that caused her death. So already the state's going pretty broad here, I think because they really weren't sure what happened to her. They just know that she died, and they believe that Levi Weeks is the one who killed her. So the opening statement was given by the prosecutor. Now put yourself in his shoes. He knows he is hopelessly outgunned legally and experience-wise, and he's dealing with the first ever murder trial in the United States. And the public is on absolute fire with rumors swirling about what was going to be discussed and what was actually going to get in at trial. So the first thing the prosecutor does is he talks about the public outcry. He basically tells the jury that they're going to need to separate the rumors that they've heard from before the trial and just look at the evidence at trial. But pretty quickly, he shifts to talking about the insane amount of resources they have at the defense table. He says, to employ so many advocates, distinguished for their eloquence and abilities, so vastly my superiors in learning, experience, and professional rank. I'll let you know whenever I'm quoting one of them directly, otherwise I'll be largely paraphrasing because this got pretty difficult to read, and I don't want you guys to have to pull up other resources to understand what's going on. So he then basically tells them it's okay that they have all of this experience and eloquence, because even if he had that, he would not use it in this trial, because he truly believes that his job is to present all the evidence as clearly as possible to them so they can make a decision as to the guilt or innocence of the prisoner. Which, I'll tell you right now, I loved. I thought that that was a great idea. It was a great way to address the elephant in the room, and it gives him a much easier job in the jury's mind. He's basically saying he doesn't need to be eloquent. He just wants to show them the information, allow them to make their determination. He also does mention that Levi Weeks was, by all accounts, a great person of great character before this event, that he's not going to try to drag the guy through the mud, and that no one complained about his character up until this event. He then says that they intend to prove that the prisoner won her affections, tricked her, had criminal intercourse with her, and deluded her that he would marry her, and then murdered her in the well. After he mentioned that he had seduced her, made her think they were going to be married, and threw her in the well, he actually paused for a few moments to let the gravity of what he said wash over the jury. He then kind of goes over the evidence that we'll end up seeing next in the video, but he does admit up front that all of the evidence is circumstantial. They don't have any physical evidence, but that circumstantial evidence can prove someone guilty of a crime like this. And he's really right, especially in the 1800s. I mean, you're not going to get surveillance video or DNA testing, which is what a lot of juries today would actually want, and probably wouldn't even convict without in most scenarios. So in this trial, the state opened first, and then after the prosecutor opened, they rolled straight into testimony. And the first witness for the prosecution was Catherine Ring, the cousin of the victim, who was told him that she was going out to get secretly married to Levi Weeks the night she disappeared. The testimony started out pretty normal. She talked about how Levi Weeks had moved in with them back in May, that he had originally been kind of hitting on one of the other girls in the house before his attention turned to Elma Sands, the victim. So then something devastating happens to the prosecution's case. At one point, he asks a question sort of like, well, what did Elma tell you about him? To which Aaron Burr feverishly objected, saying that the testimony itself from a dead person was hearsay and it could not be admitted into the court. The prosecutor did argue that statements from dead people had been allowed in court before. However, it was then countered by Aaron Burr that yes, certain statements like dying declarations had been admitted. This is a situation like you had been shot and the police ran up to you and you said, "It was him, he shot me." They would allow this statement in at a trial because it was seen as a dying declaration and you said it thinking you were about to die. The 3 judges unanimously agree with the defense and rule that no testimony given about what Elma Sands said to any of the witnesses. This is a crushing loss right out the gate for the prosecution. Their biggest piece of circumstantial evidence was that the victim told her cousin that they were going to finally secretly be married, how excited she was, and how they were going to run off together into the sunset and everything was going to be great. It was not admitted into trial, and because it was not admitted as testimony, it could not be considered by the jury. And based on the wealth of rumors that had been swirling, I definitely think the jury knew about this story, at least in passing, but still they were not allowed to consider it for guilt or innocence later on. Part of the problem here too is that Catherine and her husband were both witnesses as they ran the boarding house that the two were staying at. Her husband was actually separated from her. This is a rule where the defense can basically request 2 witnesses to be separated so they can't compare one story with the other that was told in court. So they separate the husband and the wife starts to talk about how she never saw anything improper between Levi Weeks and Elma Sands, but that they had spent several nights together, especially when she was sick, and that she had her suspicions that things were going on. Now, what's crucial here is she doesn't want to be seen as someone who was just letting them shack up in their house. That would probably ruin her reputation. But she also fiercely believes that Levi Weeks did it. It seems like throughout her testimony, she's riding this line of trying to seem very proper and fair to Levi Weeks as to not seem vindictive, but also she's really trying to get out crucial testimony for the jury to consider. She then says that on the night of the disappearance, Levi and Elma both left the house together. Then, a little later on, Elma came back into the house and went up to her room. Then she believes Elma left again. This is around 8 p.m. Around 10 or 10:30, Levi Weeks walks back into the house and he's looking for Elma. He says, "Have you seen Elma?" And she says, "No, I thought she was with you." He says, "No, she wasn't with me. I wonder where she is." And then they both go to bed. They wake up the next day. Levi comes out and asks, "What happened? Where is she?" She says, "I don't know where she could be at this point." So they're holding out hope. She had actually borrowed a headpiece or a muff from Catherine's sister, who would be a witness later on in the trial. Catherine's sister arrives to the house. Catherine was really hoping that Elma had delivered the muff back to Catherine's sister, and then they would both come back to the house. But when the sister shows up to the house and sees that Elma's nowhere in sight, Catherine asks, "Was Elma not with you?" To which the sister loses her mind and attacks Levi because she says that, "I know you were with her, I'm positive you were with her," and she's jumping all over it. Levi's whole defense here is he acts completely shocked and says, "I've been looking for her. If I would have been with her, wouldn't she have came back with me?" And he also later says, "Why would I be waiting up all night waiting for her to return if she was never going to return?" Definitely not great defenses by him, and it would only be made worse when 4 days later, body still had not been discovered. Levi Weeks met with Catherine, who he found to be crying and distraught, and told her that mourning and grieving would not bring any solace because he said, quote, "It is my firm belief now that she is in eternity." So he basically said, "Don't be so upset. I'm sure she's dead and all of this crying won't bring her back," which is a crazy thing to say 4 days after someone went missing with no body recovered, especially given the time period. There was a little more testimony about the victim's demeanor. Catherine said that she had never seen Elma more excited and happy than she had on the day of her disappearance, presumably because she was trying to get across to the jury how excited she was for the prospect of being married later that night. And then on cross-examination, this is where the defense questions the witness. The defense just basically got her to say that she had never suspected Levi Weeks of doing anything bad before and that he had always been a stand-up guy up until that point. That's pretty much it. They move past her testimony pretty quickly, which is a pretty decent strategy. You don't want to overreact in a trial because it makes the jury pay attention a lot of times. And Catherine was definitely their strongest witness, especially with some of the witnesses you're about to see that come next. One more thing about her testimony that's just kind of weird to picture. Like I said, her husband was removed because he'd be testifying later. But at some point during the trial, he had actually gone back into the courtroom and walked up and started standing behind her. The only thing that's really mentioned about this is that Alexander Hamilton stands up and says, "Hey, he's not supposed to be here," and the court kicks him out. I don't really know what to make of this. I don't know. I have to imagine he just walked in and everyone stared at him while he just walked up behind his wife and she kept answering questions, but just something interesting to note. So the next witness up was Hope Sands. This was the sister. She testified that she had found the two alone in Elma's bedroom several times. She also admitted to attacking Levi, and she also talked about how he tried his hardest to convince her that he wasn't who did this. She said he used, quote, all possible means to convince me of his innocence. So he actually came up to her one day before the body was found and asked for her to vouch for him with the police now, because he said if a body's found, he was definitely assumed to have done it unless the body was found very far away. When she said she wouldn't vouch for him, he actually produced a piece of paper and asked her if she would write down that he didn't fancy Elma any more than he had fancied any of the other girls that were living at the boarding home. To which she said, I can't do that because you definitely fancied her more than anyone. You two were courting. A lot of the cross-examination here from the defense was just trying to ask questions about whether she had been flirted with by Levi before and whether Levi had flirted with other people. Trying to put in the jury's head that Levi was just kind of generally flirting with everyone and wasn't specifically set on Elma. Next up was Catherine's husband, the guy who was standing behind her. His testimony was that Levi had been lodging at the home. A strange thing happened where he was describing that Catherine had left some of her clothes behind. I've never seen this in a trial transcript before, but one of the juror members actually stood up and asked of whether or not the victim left the house naked, which was a little strange, and it felt like the juror also wasn't paying attention because he had said that she had left without her clothes, but given the context, it was pretty clear he meant without her normal clothes that she would wear. But he also testified that while he had his suspicions that they were courting, that he never saw any unmodest behavior. Keep in mind, he would be responsible for what was going on in his own house. On cross-examination, he repeats what Catherine said, basically saying that when Levi returned at 10 p.m., he asked where the victim was and then remarked that it was weird Elma would have left at this hour. Elias Ring agreed and just kind of shrugged it off. He then also says that the defendant came up to him and asked him not to testify against him. And one of the defense attorneys actually asked Elias if he had threatened Levi Weeks. And Elias said, yeah, I confronted him because I told him I thought it was him that murdered her. And he turned, quote, white as ashes and trembled like a leaf. And he would go on in his testimony to admit that also that Levi Weeks was of good character up until that day. We get a few more witnesses that establish that the two were courting, that she was modest, that she was of good character, but that none of them saw anything directly inappropriate. But then we get to Richard Croucher. Now, Richard Croucher gave some pretty crucial testimony, but the problem with Richard Croucher is he was a pretty known commodity around New York City, and not for the normal ways like Ezra Weeks and John McComb, who would later take the stand. Richard Croucher was known around town as a bit of a loon. He would hand out pamphlets talking about ghouls and ghosts committing murders, and he was generally seen as being pretty odd amongst the general public. However, he gave testimony for the prosecution because he lived in the boarding home for a time and knew that there was a warm courtship going on between Levi Weeks and Elma Sands. He also testified that he actually saw Levi Weeks leaving her room nearly naked. Unfortunately, never told anyone about it and had only realized it before trial. So then the defense starts to cross-examine him, and the first thing they ask him is if he has any ill will towards Levi Weeks, to which Croucher says, I have no malice against the man. But then the defense asks about the time that he fought him in the stairwell. Croucher says, well, I have no malice towards him, but I do think he's a jerk that disrespects women. So immediately his credibility is even more questioned than it already was. But all in all, Croucher gets out of this interaction fairly unscathed, but he would be absolutely torched later in the trial. They also pressed him a bit about his route home because he got home around 10 p.m. as well on the night of the disappearance. They tried to ask if he went over by the well. I'm not sure if this was because they were trying to say he might have committed the murder or if he had potentially seen who was committing the murder, but he really had no idea how he got home that night. He couldn't articulate it well to them, and he kind of came off as confused at this point. And then we actually get Levi Weeks' apprentice, who would sleep in the same room as Levi Weeks. Now, this apprentice, who was named William Anderson, testified that he never actually thought that Levi was more into her than he was the other girls, but that he was definitely into her. And what was bizarre about his testimony was he said frequently in the middle of the night that Levi Weeks would get up from bed, go over to him and check to see if he was still sleeping. He'd lean in to see how heavy William was breathing to determine whether he was still asleep, and that certain nights he would actually sneak out in the middle of the night. Then we get to Susanna Broad, who was described by the transcript as aged and infirm, which I thought was pretty unfair to just say that she was infirm from the outset before we got her testimony. It was the theory of the prosecution that Ezra and Levi had got into a one-horse sleigh that was owned by Ezra, stripped all the bells off of it, and rode it to just outside the property, picked up Elma, and then murdered her. Now, of course, it was already flimsy as it was, and they were not about to bring Ezra Weeks, the more famous of the two brothers, into trial as well, but they definitely thought he had something to do with it. So Susanna Broad was there to testify that she had actually seen Ezra Weeks' carriage leave his property no later than 8 o'clock and return just after 10. She said all the bells had been removed as to make the sleigh quiet. And keep in mind, this is 1799 we're talking about. There's very little lights in the streets, and this is also a fairly rural part of Manhattan, at least by our standards, so it's going to be pretty dark in the middle of the night. This seems like great testimony until the cross-examination. Remember, Elma Sands went missing on December 22nd. The defense asked when this happened. The trial was in March, so only 3 months had really passed. She had no idea what night this was. So you're saying, well, maybe she doesn't remember the specific night, so what? Well, they asked her specifically what month, to which she still couldn't answer. Aaron Burr then asked her, was it before or after Christmas? To which she responded, it was definitely after Christmas. And when they asked her what month again, and if it was January, she responded that it was definitely January where all of this occurred, which clearly meant she was horribly confused about the timeline. Whether or not she actually saw the carriage leave on the night of the 22nd, it basically didn't matter to the jury at all. And I like to believe that Aaron Burr kind of looked over at the jury and shrugged with a look that said, hey, we can't really take her seriously, can we? The next witness was Catherine Lyon, who had a pretty crazy story that she believed she saw the victim after 8 p.m. with two men who were well-dressed, and then later around 9 o'clock heard someone yell over by the well,
"Murder! Murder! Oh, save me!"
That was really the bulk of her testimony, and on cross, they got her to admit she actually didn't see the victim's face, but just knew her from her shape and form. And really crucially, she said she never saw any one-horse sleigh and that the victim wasn't even near a horse at the time. So already we're seeing incongruity in the state's story from their testimonies. Another witness, Margaret Freeman, testified that a sleigh and two men and a woman passed her at about 8:15, and she was about the distance away from Elma Sands' house that you'd imagine her to be at 8:15. The next witness said that they saw a sleigh coming from the direction of Ezra Weeks' house. There was also testimony from the father of the little boy who found the missing hairpiece. At that point, they called it for the day. They were originally just going to take a break, but they ended up deciding to just come back the next day. So the next day, Tuesday, August 1st, there was a ton of testimony from doctors. The state put up there to say that she was beaten before she was thrown into the well. There was some speculation that she was pregnant, and it was actually a rumor that got around a lot at the time, but the medical examiners apparently proved that that was not the case. I couldn't really understand how they proved it, but using the medical technology they had available, they seemed to be able to prove that she was not pregnant. The only other witness worth mentioning on the prosecutor's side was David Lint. He was the one who actually pulled Elma Sands' body out of the well, and the defense asked him a lot about whether or not he thought he might have damaged her by banging her against the rocks of the well on the way up, to which he said he was very gentle with her. At this point, the prosecutor gave his closing arguments, which I could basically sum up as him going up to the jury and kind of saying, hey, that didn't go as well as I had hoped, but there was some circumstantial evidence in there, and that's enough to convict. If there was enough for you, then you should vote to convict. Then the defense gave their opening. I've seen different reports as to who gave the opening. This specific transcript just said it was counsel for the defense. My guess, though, is that it was Alexander Hamilton, based on what I've read so far. And I told you earlier how I really enjoyed the opening statement by the prosecutor and how I thought he did a very good job with what he had. And Alexander Hamilton blew him out of the water. The eloquence with which Hamilton spoke was such that it made the prosecutors seem like he was from the woods in the Appalachian Mountains. Hamilton's main argument was that the public was after the Weeks family and was jealous of the Weeks family for their success. Part of his opening, to give you an idea of his eloquence, was, if this doctrine of presumptive evidence is to prevail and to be sufficient to convict, what remorse of conscience must a juror feel for having convicted a man who afterwards appeared to be innocent? So he sounds real fancy to this group of jurors. The defense then started putting on their witnesses. First up was Demas Mead, who lived with Ezra Weeks and testified that no one had taken out the horse and sleigh, and that Demas was actually the one who was in charge of the horse and sleigh, and that he could personally testify that John McComb's wife, Levi Weeks, and Ezra Weeks were all at the house for the hours that Elma Sands went missing, and that none of them left until Levi left to go home, and that it wasn't enough time to commit a murder. There was also some testimony from other witnesses like Joseph Watkins, who had lived with them, who said that he had heard other men in Elma Sands' room. There was essentially a lot of slut-shaming coming from the defense's side, who tried to portray her a little bit more loosely moraled than the prosecution did. The main hammers of the defense, like I said, was Ezra Weeks, the defendant's brother, and John McComb, two of the most famous architects in New York City and two of the most famous men in New York City, who were both close personal friends of all of the defense attorneys and had even built both of their homes. I mean, these guys were always hanging out, they were always seen together, and they were the crucial part of the testimony. And to play devil's advocate here, the story really went the way that Levi Weeks was saying it did, that he was with his brother and this rich architect, then it would make sense that they were witnesses. So one other thing that was brought up in the opening that I really liked was that Alexander Hamilton basically talks to the jury and says that he was very thankful to see how they listened to the first part of the trial because he was initially worried that a random jury could convict on such weak evidence, but he kind of flirts with the jury a little bit and says that once he saw how seriously they were taking the evidence, he knew that even they would see how terrible of a case this was against the defendant, but not to worry that he and his defense team were going to show that it was beyond a shadow of a doubt that their client could have had nothing to do with this case. And that all came full circle when they recalled Mr. Coucher to the witness stand. Now, this is where they presented him with these pamphlets that he would hand out around New York City about ghouls and apparitions and ghosts that would commit murders. He denied that he did this, though all my readings show that this was something he was very well known to be doing. It seems like he was just trying to save face. But the wild part of this, depending on which source you read, Hamilton stood and grabbed two candles and placed them on either side of Coucher and basically pointed to him and looked at the jury and said, "Look at him, look how crazy he looks." And this was pretty brutal, especially considering that this was actually their last witness. They ended their whole case with this guy who was the second strongest witness for the prosecution. They definitely kept this in their back pocket to end on a big note. The source I read didn't directly say that. Alexander Hamilton's son relayed the story as Alexander Hamilton had related to him. There are some fun drawings that show him holding up a candlestick to expose how crazy he was in front of the group. I think it's one of those things that probably got embellished as time went on. The most likely scenario is that they did put a candle nearby him because they wanted to subtly draw attention to it, and that got blown out of proportion later and then exaggerated by some of the parties, especially Hamilton. But with that, the defense closed, and the prosecutor actually wanted them to wait to give the jury instruction because he said that he hadn't slept in 2.5 days. And given the number of witnesses that both sides had, I really believe him. And he seemed to have been working alone against these three juggernauts on the defense side. Ultimately, the judges actually denied this request and they went into the jury charge. So the jury charge, you can think of them as the instructions for the jury. Judges still read them now. They basically tell the jury to be impartial, to only consider evidence that was presented in trial and not to bring in outside sources. The Chief Justice here got very loosey-goosey with this, and he started just commenting on the evidence himself, started talking about inconsistencies with the prosecution's story, and believe it or not, the last thing he said to the jury before he sent them back was that all three judges had unanimously agreed amongst themselves that there was not enough evidence to convict Levi Weeks. However, they were going to still let the jury decide and not issue a directed verdict. A directed verdict is what a judge can issue when they believe that no reasonable jury could find in one way or another. So the jury went back into the jury room and came back 5 minutes later with a not guilty. This is where the transcript ends, and we're going off a lot of secondhand sources, but several of them say that Catherine Ring, the first witness and the one closest to the victim, supposedly stood up in the courtroom and pointed at the judges and the defense and said, "If any of you die of natural causes, I will know that there was no justice in the world." So given that, let's round things out with saying how all of these players died. Many of you will be familiar with Alexander Hamilton's death. He died at the hands of Aaron Burr after a duel in New Jersey where he was shot. Aaron Burr did technically die of natural causes. However, he was a disgraced politician, exiled from public life, and he never recovered socially. The final attorney for the defense, Livingston, like I said before, would go on to become a justice of the Supreme Court. He would die of natural causes, but it would largely be said that he never wrote any memorable opinions during his time on the Supreme Court, though it could be argued that just being on the Supreme Court is such an honor in and of itself. One of the judges would actually later be involved in a duel in which he would kill his opponent, and he took it so severely that he is said to have died of melancholy. I couldn't quite tell if that meant he committed suicide or if people just believe that he died of a broken heart, which was a term that went around a lot at the time and you still see today. And finally, one of the other judges disappeared. They believe there was a political assassination and his body was never found. So maybe Catherine Ring did get a little justice in the end. Now, I want to give you a little bit of my take here. I opened the video by talking about knowing that someone lied and being able to prove it, and I gave you the clickbaity title of whether Alexander Hamilton rigged this murder trial. Do I think that Levi Weeks probably killed Elma Sands? I do. Do I think the state proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt at trial? Absolutely not. I would go so far to say that the state would have trouble getting that case even indicted today if they tried to move forward on it with such little evidence. But trials were different at the time. There was less out there that they could get, so I think the prosecutor did a great job with what he had, but it just was unfortunately not enough. Still, though, I do want to leave you with a quote from the book that I think is very important, where the author says, "On the question of the guilt or innocence of the accused, I shall say nothing, as I conceive it is not the province of an individual to rejudge his case or arraign the verdict of his peers." But it's the internet in 2025. It's been 225 years. So if you have some opinions, you can leave them in the comments below. If you want to support what I'm doing here, please join the Patreon or like and subscribe. It's greatly appreciated. I am still putting together the Austin Yogurt Shop murders video, but I did want to kind of give you guys a fun little dive in history in the meantime. I've been Good Bayou Boudreaux. Thank you so much for watching, and have a good night.
Sit down. A client, Larry Weeks is innocent. Call your first witness. That's all you had to say.
Okay.